Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video. Now, I recently published a paper on Noxacusis on my subreddit, and I will be linking this in the description below and in the comments. So if you want to read it in its entirety, you can go and visit those links. We also have another update actually from a DIY user who was not in my initial study. So we will be taking a look at that later on as well, after our Noxacusis lesson. Now let's take a deep dive into Noxacusis, the painful disorder associated with extreme severe ear pain. Now, I'd like to firstly shout out the people who helped me collect all of this data and organize it into one comprehensive paper, and that would definitely be the Noxacusis community in the Tinnitus Labs Discord, and also Greg, who we will call Cranial Boy, whose initial theory I based most of this research on. And the research that is mentioned in this video is also based on the work of amazing researchers, such as, of course, Susan Shore, Thanos Xenopoulos, A. Norena, and others. Now, what is Noxacusis? Now, obviously, Noxacusis is not your typical auditory disorder. It is a very complex condition where peripheral damage, which I guess you could say is problems in the ear itself, interacts with central sensitization, which is an amplified response from the nervous system, and of course, maladaptive plasticity, which are changes in the brain's neural pathways that actually worsen symptoms rather than fixing the problem. I guess you could call maladaptive plasticity a sort of failed homeostatic plasticity. And in neuroscience, homeostatic plasticity is basically the capacity of neurons to regulate their own excitability relative to the overall network activity. So for people who have tinnitus, Noxacusis, and other conditions, maladaptive plasticity is the plasticity that sort of takes over the homeostatic plasticity. Homeostatic plasticity is what our body, I guess, strives for whenever there is any sort of damage. And for people who do get auditory damage or inflammation or anything like that, and do not get tinnitus, I guess you could say their homeostatic plasticity was successful. Whereas for people like us with tinnitus, Noxacusis, and other forms of sensitization, the homeostatic plasticity was unsuccessful, ergo we have maladaptive plasticity. Now, a critical piece of the Noxacusis puzzle, so to speak, lies in the middle ear, particularly the tensor tympani muscle, or the TTM, as we will be calling it from now on. Now, this muscle reacts to loud sounds by contracting to dampen vibrations and protect the ear. However, when overused due to acoustic trauma, damage caused by loud noises or sudden pressure changes, or acoustic shock, it can trigger a cascade of damaging events. The first one is muscle injury and inflammation. Hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen in tissues, occurs when the TTM is overcontracted for extended periods. This depletes ATP, which is something I mentioned before. This is the cell's primary energy source, and triggers the release of inflammatory molecules, such as CGRP, also known as calcitonin gene-related peptide, and substance P, which are chemicals that cause swelling and pain by activating pain receptors, which are called nociceptors. Now, another thing that happens is type 2 afferent activation. This is based on C. Liu's paper on type 2, unmediated type 2 afferent neurons. Now, these specialized nerve fibers in the cochlea are sensitive to damage and inflammation. When they are activated by the pro-inflammatory molecules released during middle ear injury, like mentioned above, they send pain signals to the brain. And also, they can potentially activate the cranial nerves. More on that later. Now, these fibers resemble C fibers found in the skin, which are responsible for transmitting slow and burning pain. Just a little bit of a note here, the stabbing pain, which a lot of people feel in their face and in their ear, is actually the activation of the cranial nerves. A lot of people don't know this, but there is actually some branches of the cranial nerves, like the trigeminal one, that actually go through the middle ear and the ear canals as well. The role of cranial nerve activation or hyperexcitability in Noxacusis is very significant, but we are going to talk more about that later. The most important thing to understand from this section is that the peripheral damage that I described previously lays the foundation for the central sensitization that occurs in Noxacusis. Now let's start this section by talking about the trigeminal cervical complex. Now, the trigeminal cervical complex, or the TCC, as we will refer to it from now on, acts as a pain hub, integrating sensory signals from the ear, neck, and face. And here's how it contributes. The first contribution is bidirectional sensory motor integration. Now, cranial nerves like the trigeminal and glossopharyngeal nerve and cervical roots such as C2 and C3, they converge in the TCC, the trigeminal cervical complex. Over time, this amplifies the pain signals, causing referred pain across the ear, neck, and face. And as we all know from Thanos Xenopoulos' research, damage to the cochlea or acoustic shock reduces KCNQ2-3 channel function and HCN channel function as well. Voltage-gated potassium ion channels are absolutely crucial in regulating the nerve signal across the axon down to the axon terminal, as we know from my previous videos. And HCN channels are also extremely important during the process of hyperpolarization. So when there's a disbalance or dysfunction of voltage-gated potassium ion channels, specifically KCNQ2-3, this means that the nerve signal, which is very strong, cannot be regulated while it is passing down the nerve cell to the next one. If we imagine the nerve cells or the neural pathway to be like a sequence of pipes with a lot of pressure inside, and the nerve signal being the pressure inside these pipes, the voltage-gated potassium ion channels would be something like valves that are all along the surface of these pipes. And to decrease the pressure, these valves can be opened throughout the network of pipes, potentially decreasing the pressure as it moves on through the system of pipes. Now, the dysfunction of these voltage-gated potassium ion channels means that these valves are not being opened, allowing for the pressure to be released from these pipes. So the pressure, the very, very strong pressure, just continues building up more and more. Hopefully this analogy was enough to understand the importance of these channels. This hyperactivity manifests as increased spontaneous firing in DCN fusiform cells, which, as we all know, integrate somatosensory and auditory signals. Now, As we can probably realize, the trigeminal cervical complex and the DCN being so closely tied together through the parallel fibers of the granule cells, you can probably imagine how feedback loops in the auditory and somatosensory pathway can actually cement and reinforce this hyperactivity or hyperexcitability or synchronization. So basically, when the body tries to engage the homeostatic plasticity, what actually happens is, of course, the maladaptive plasticity. So when the body tries to reorganize these connections in the dorsal cochlear nucleus after damage, what it does is that it engages or synchronizes with the neurons of the trigeminal cervical complex. So people who have this very strong synchronization, it can actually lead to Noxacusis. And people who do not have such a strong synchronization of the trigeminal cervical complex, they do not have Noxacusis. Now, before anybody asks, the key differences in Noxacusis and just somatic tinnitus, which is also the interaction of somatosensory pathways like SP5 in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. The key difference is that somatic tinnitus involves altered interactions in sound processing networks or synchronization of the sound processing networks, while Noxacusis involves the central sensitization process of the trigeminal cervical complex, which affects pain specifically. So therefore, a person can have very somatic tinnitus without Noxacusis because, well, the mechanisms and neural circuits, so to speak, contributing to these conditions are distinct, even if they do overlap in certain areas. Now, of course, let's talk a little bit about loudness hyperacusis and the role of the ventral cochlear nucleus. Now, the loudness hyperacusis, which is a close cousin of Noxacusis, so to speak, involves hyperactive patterns in the ventral cochlear nucleus. Now, the research from Susan Shore highlights that there is enhanced response to intense sounds or certain sounds. And the VCN neurons exhibit faster spike latencies and higher firing rates, which actually amplify the sound perception. Now, there are known cases, such as me, for example, where the tinnitus spiked easier or with less noise due to catastrophic loudness hyperacusis. Now, this totally makes sense because if the VCN neurons exhibit these faster spike latencies and higher firing rates, because of its location in the neural pathway, specifically the auditory pathway, right before the DCN, these signals that come from the cochlea through the auditory nerve fibers are actually, I guess you could say, they're on steroids before they enter the DCN. It's actually really simple when you think about it. Stronger signals coming in from the VCN to the DCN leads to higher spike latencies and higher firing rates also in the DCN, which then spreads to the somatosensory pathway and eventually can influence the central sensitization of the trigeminal cervical complex. And if anybody is wondering why loudness hyperacusis can improve while the tinnitus does not, and this happens actually a lot, well, it's just because of the dorsal cochlear nucleus being after the VCN and the neural pathway. And while a person's VCN having decreased hyperexcitability or spike latencies could lead to an improvement in their hyperacusis and reactivity, usually this does not, or this natural improvement is not enough for influence on the DCN. Now, one thing that I always tell everybody is that neural pathways are two-directional streets. Now, while most neural pathways are actually biased towards one direction, ergo the nerve signals travel in one direction, this does not mean that they cannot travel backwards. Things like feedback loops and retrograde signaling can actually influence the neural pathway in a descending order, so to speak. And this is exactly why Susan Shore's device has cured loudness hyperacusis for so many people, is that the spike timing dependent plasticity or long-term depression is very, very strong. It's a very strong signal which can influence the neural pathway in a descending order. Another very interesting case that I remember reading about was there's a woman who worked in a nightclub, and there was no problems. She had no problems with her ears for many, many years. But there was one situation when she got punched in the jaw by somebody in this nightclub, and shortly after she developed loudness hyperacusis, and then eventually Noxacusis as well. So this is a very strong testament to the theory of central sensitization and the interactions of the dorsal cochlear nucleus with the somatosensory pathways as well. Now a little bit more about the Norena model. Now, Norena is a researcher who has an amazing paper called An Integrative Model Accounting for the Symptom Cluster Triggered After an Acoustic Shock. I recommend everybody read this paper because it is absolutely groundbreaking and amazing in understanding these conditions. So basically, according to his model, he proposes that middle ear inflammation initiates a cascade, transitioning the peripheral injury into central pain syndromes. So, in other words, inflammatory mediators diffuse to the cochlea, possibly affecting type 2 afferent, and the persistent nociceptive signaling centralizes within the TCC and sensitizes the DCN through retrograde signaling, creating maladaptive feedback loops. This is what I mentioned in the beginning of our video. So definitely go check out his paper. I'll be linking it in the description as well. Now overall, what do we have? This is a screenshot from the paper that I'll be linking that I wrote with the help of the community. We have peripheral injury and inflammation. Middle ear inflammation activates the TTM nociceptors and type 2 afferents. Pro-inflammatory molecules diffuse to the cochlea, perpetuating nociceptive signaling. And these nociceptive inputs centralize within the trigeminal-cervical complex, driving the widespread pain referral. The DCN and VCN neurons exhibit hyperactivity due to their cross-modal plasticity. And this cross-modal interactions between the DCN, TCC, and cranial nerves sustain the maladaptive hypersensitivity, and basically the cascade of all of these symptom clusters or everything going wrong due to decreased inhibitory signaling, KCNQ2-3 dysfunction. Now, as I've mentioned before, potentially targeting the DCN hyperactivity with the Susan Shore device and also targeting the KCNQ2-3 dysfunction could potentially disrupt these feedback loops, meaning there's a chance that the Susan Shore device can actually treat Noxacusis as well. The science lines up. Of course, we won't know until we actually test it out in my next trials. Now, what can actually be done for this? Well, up on the screen, I have different treatment implications that could potentially work. Obviously, we have the KCNQ2-3 channel openers. It could reduce hyperactivity and actually foster or kickstart the homeostatic plasticity, but that's just a theory. Clomipramine and gabapentin, these meds are really good at modulating the central pain pathways, and a lot of people have actually seen full suppression and improvement of their Noxacusis on clomipramine. Unfortunately, clomipramine is usually a double-edged sword because, as we all know, the dorsal cochlear nucleus has a lot of serotonin receptors. So While some people did see their central sensitization or Noxacusis decrease, they also saw their tinnitus increase as well while taking clomipramine. If your Nox is debilitating, clomipramine is definitely an option to try out. Now, obviously, we have the option of neuromodulation, which I explained before, being Susan Shore's device. Inflammation management is actually also something that helps. So, some anti-inflammatory agents that target the neurogenic inflammation in the middle ear. Also, liquid magnesium chloride has shown to help a lot of people. So has Ambrexol. And something a little bit more taboo or less known is the low histamine diet, actually, which is very anti-inflammatory. Now, I saw one woman actually be completely cured from her Noxacusis after consistently being on a low histamine diet for a few months. Now, obviously, addressing neck and jaw tension and also postural issues is very important for this, alongside noise avoidance. Now, there is some research that shows that stress apparently can worsen central sensitization, and I know it's a little bit counterintuitive to tell people to not be stressed because these conditions obviously do induce a lot of stress, but that's something to keep in mind. Also, Botox. Botox is something that has shown to help some people. Now, overall, what can we conclude? Noxacusis arises from a convergence of middle ear pathology, cranial nerve sensitization, and central auditory somatosensory interactions. By addressing peripheral inflammation, central sensitization at the TCC and the DCN, and maladaptive plasticity, some integrated therapeutic strategies do show promise in relieving these symptoms. And this model and paper that I recently published obviously highlights that we need multimodal interventions to reverse this chronic pain or sensitization and hypersensitivity. Now, for those of you who skipped through the whole video to get to this update, shame on you. But regardless, here it is. So this guy says that his main tone is down about 60%, and it's very maskable. And his already mild hyperacusis is basically gone only after 2.5 weeks of usage. This lines up perfectly with the results of my previous study, and it's great to see that people are still seeing improvement. That's about it for today. See ya.